Ethan Caldwell adjusted the worn leather jacket on his shoulders, the faint scent of motor oil clinging to the fabric. He stood outside a bustling farmer's market in the heart of a small coastal town, the salty breeze from the nearby ocean mingling with the aroma of fresh bread and ripe fruit. For the first time in his 32 years, he wasn't surrounded by the polished glass and steel of his tech empire, Caldwell Innovations, or the suffocating expectations of boardrooms and investors. Here, under the faded awning of a produce stall, he was just Ethan Moore, a man with no past, no fortune, and no reputation to uphold. The thought sent a thrill through him, a rush of freedom he hadn't felt since he was a child chasing waves on his father's yacht. The market was alive with noise, vendors haggling, children laughing, the rhythmic crash of waves in the distance. Ethan's eyes darted to a handwritten sign tacked to a wooden post, "Help Wanted, Delivery Runner, Seaside Co-op." He smirked. A billionaire running errands for minimum wage? It was absurd, and that was exactly why he'd chosen it. For months, he'd been suffocating under the weight of his own success, deals worth billions, a penthouse that felt more like a museum, and a social circle that cared more about his net worth than his soul. He needed to know if there was more to life than the numbers on his balance sheet. So, he'd traded his tailored suits for thrift store finds, his chauffeured Bentley for a beat-up bicycle, and his identity for a lie. He approached the stall where the sign hung, his boots scuffing against the gravel. A woman stood behind a table piled high with baskets of tomatoes and jars of homemade jam. She was tall, with sun-streaked blonde hair tied back in a loose braid, and eyes the color of the stormy sea beyond the cliffs. Her hands moved with purpose, sorting produce with a rhythm that spoke of years spent working the earth. She didn't look up as he approached, her focus fixed on a customer haggling over a bag of apples. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice roughened by the persona he'd crafted, Ethan Moore, a drifter with no roots and fewer prospects. "I'm here about the delivery job." The woman glanced up, her gaze sharp and assessing. She wiped her hands on a faded apron, the edges frayed from use, and studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You don't look like the type who sticks around," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "This isn't a gig for someone passing through." Ethan met her stare, careful to keep his posture slouched, his expression uncertain. "I'm not passing through. I need the work. Been a rough few months." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but jerked her chin toward a stack of crates near the back of the stall. "Name's Mara. I run the co-op's deliveries. You want the job, you start now. Take those to the bakery on Elm Street, 3 blocks down, can't miss it. Don't drop anything, and don't dawdle. We'll see if you're worth keeping." Ethan nodded, suppressing the grin that threatened to break through. He hefted the crates onto his shoulder, the weight unfamiliar but not unpleasant, and set off toward Elm Street. The bicycle he'd bought for $10 at a garage sale rattled under the load, but he pedaled with determination, weaving through the market's chaos. The bakery was a squat, weathered building with a sign that read Driftwood Delights in peeling blue paint. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and yeast, and a plump woman with flour-dusted hands waved him toward the counter. "From Mara?" she asked, peering into the crates. Ethan nodded, and she handed him a crumpled $5 bill. "Tip for the trouble. Tell her the sourdough's ready for pickup tomorrow." He pocketed the cash, his first honest earning in years, and cycled back to the market. Mara was waiting, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You're slow," she said, but there was a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Still, you didn't break anything. Job's yours if you want it. $6 an hour, plus tips. Starts at dawn." "I'll take it," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He'd done it, slipped into this world unnoticed, unjudged. For now, he was just a delivery runner, not a titan of industry. And as he watched Mara turn back to her work, her braid swinging with each movement, he felt a spark of curiosity about her. She was no nonsense, guarded, but there was a quiet strength in her that intrigued him. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into the role. The work was grueling, hours spent pedaling through the town's winding streets, hauling crates of vegetables, fish, and baked goods to shops and homes. His legs ached, his hands blistered, and his lungs burned from the salty air, but he relished every second of it. The simplicity of it all was intoxicating. No emails to answer, no contracts to negotiate, just the road, the wind, and the occasional gruff thank you from a shopkeeper. Mara was his constant shadow, barking orders with a precision that rivaled his former COO. Faster, more, she'd snap as he loaded his bike. Those clams won't deliver themselves. But there were moments, small, fleeting ones, when her tone softened. One morning, as he arrived at the co-op soaked from an unexpected rain, she tossed him a towel without a word, her lips twitching into something that might have been a smile. "You're not as useless as I thought," she said one afternoon, leaning against a crate as he caught his breath after a long run. The sun was setting, painting the market in shades of gold and pink, and for once, she didn't seem in a hurry to send him off. "High praise," Ethan quipped, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's your secret, then? You run this place like it's a military op." Mara's laugh was short, almost bitter. "Years of practice. This co-op's all I've got, keeps the town fed, keeps me sane. You don't slack when people depend on you." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He'd spent years building a company that employed thousands, yet he'd never felt the weight of their reliance the way Mara did for this tiny community. "Sounds like a lot to carry," he said quietly. She shrugged, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "You get used to it. Or you don't, and you leave. Which one are you, more?" Ethan hesitated, the lie of his identity heavy on his tongue. "I'm sticking around," he said finally, meeting her eyes. "Got nowhere else to be." Mara studied him, her expression unreadable, then nodded. "We'll see." That evening, as he pedaled back to the cramped studio apartment he'd rented under his fake name, Ethan's mind churned. Mara was more than just a taskmaster, she was a puzzle, a woman who'd built a life out of necessity and grit. He'd come here to escape his own world, but now he found himself drawn to hers, to the raw honesty of it. And as the days stretched into weeks, he began to wonder if this experiment might unravel more than just his perspective, it might unravel him. The sun rose over the coastal town, casting a soft glow on the weathered rooftops and the endless stretch of ocean beyond. Ethan Caldwell, or Ethan Moore, as he was known here, woke to the creak of his rickety bed frame and the distant cry of gulls. 2 weeks into his undercover life as a delivery runner for the seaside co-op, the rhythm of the job had settled into his bones. His hands, once smooth and unmarred from years behind a desk, were now calloused, his shoulders broader from the constant hauling. He barely recognized himself in the cracked mirror above the sink, and that was the point. But as he pulled on his thrift store jeans and pedaled toward the market, a quiet unease gnawed at him. The deeper he sank into this world, the harder it became to keep his two lives separate. The market was already buzzing when he arrived, vendors shouting over the hum of early shoppers. Mara stood at her usual post, directing a teenage volunteer with the same brisk efficiency Ethan had come to expect. She glanced his way as he parked his bike, her stormy eyes narrowing slightly. "You're late," she said, though the clock on the co-op's wall showed he was 3 minutes early. "Traffic," Ethan replied with a grin, nodding toward the empty street behind him. Mara rolled her eyes but didn't argue, tossing him a clipboard with the day's delivery list. "Fishmongers first. Don't let old man Grady talk your ear off, he'll keep you there all day if you let him." "Got it," Ethan said, securing the crates of fresh cod to his bike. As he pedaled off, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mara's gaze lingered on him a beat longer than usual. She was sharp, too sharp, and he wondered how long he could keep her from seeing through his carefully crafted story. The day passed in a blur of deliveries, fish to the docks, bread to the cafe, jars of honey to the gift shop on the pier. Ethan's legs burned with each uphill climb, but the ache was a welcome distraction from the thoughts circling his mind. He'd built Caldwell Innovations from a garage startup to a global powerhouse, a feat that had earned him magazine covers and a Forbes ranking. Yet here, sweating under the midday sun with salt stinging his eyes, he felt more alive than he ever had in a boardroom. It was the people, the gruff fisherman who slipped him an extra coin, the cafe owner who offered him a leftover croissant, Mara with her quiet intensity, that made this life real. And that realization scared him. By late afternoon, he returned to the co-op, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. Mara was unloading a shipment of potatoes, her braid unraveling as she worked. Ethan jumped in without a word, stacking sacks beside her. For a while, they moved in silence, the only sounds the thud of potatoes and the distant crash of waves. Then Mara spoke, her voice low. "You're good at this, you know. Better than I expected." Ethan paused, wiping his brow. "What, stacking spuds? High bar." She smirked, but her expression softened. "No. Showing up. Most people don't last a week hauling crates in this heat. You've got grit, more." Her words hit him like a punch. Grit. He'd negotiated billion-dollar mergers, faced down hostile takeovers, but this, manual labor in a nowhere town, was what earned him that word from her. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "Means a lot coming from you." Mara's eyes flickered with something, curiosity, maybe, but she turned back to the potatoes before he could decipher it. "Don't let it go to your head. You're still slow on the bike." He laughed, the sound easing the tension in his chest. But as they finished the unloading, a shadow loomed over his newfound ease. His phone, buried in his jacket pocket under a false name, vibrated with a message he couldn't ignore. He slipped away to check it, his stomach twisting as he read the screen. "Ethan, board's losing patience. You've been off-grid too long. Call me. Vanessa." Vanessa Pierce, his COO and the only person who knew where he'd gone. He'd told her he needed a month to clear his head, but the truth was more complicated. Now, 3 weeks in, the cracks in his plan were showing. He typed a quick reply, "Need more time. Handle it." And shoved the phone back into hiding. But the weight of his real life lingered, a tether he couldn't quite cut. That evening, the co-op hosted a small gathering, a thank you for the volunteers who kept the market running. Lanterns hung from the stalls, casting a warm glow over tables laden with grilled fish, cornbread, and pitchers of iced tea. Ethan sat across from Mara, picking at a plate of food as she recounted a story about a delivery gone wrong years ago, her laugh rare and unguarded. Around them, the townsfolk chatted and danced to a local band's upbeat tune, the air thick with salt and camaraderie. "You ever think about leaving?" Ethan asked suddenly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "Seeing what's out there?" Mara's smile faded, her fork pausing midair. "Used to. When I was a kid, I wanted to travel, see Paris, Tokyo, all those places you read about. But life doesn't always let you dream that big." She set the fork down, her gaze distant. "My mom ran this co-op before me. When she got sick, I took over. Been here ever since." Ethan's throat tightened. "You stayed for her." "And for them," she said, nodding toward the crowd. "This place keeps people fed, keeps the town alive. Dreams don't pay bills, or keep roofs over heads." Her words echoed in his mind, starkly different from the world he'd left behind, where dreams were currency and roofs were penthouses. "You're stronger than most," he said, meaning every word. Mara shrugged, but her eyes met his, searching. "What about you, more? What's your story? You show up out of nowhere, no roots, no baggage. People don't just drift into a place like this without something chasing them." Ethan's pulse quickened. He'd rehearsed his backstory, lost his job, needed a fresh start, but under her gaze, it felt flimsy. Just needed a change, he said, forcing a casual tone. Sometimes you've got to strip everything down to figure out what matters. She didn't push, but the silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken questions. Before she could say more, a fisherman called her over to settle a bet about crab yields, and she left the table with a reluctant glance back at him. Later, as the gathering wound down, Ethan helped stack chairs, his mind racing. Mara saw too much, understood too much. He'd come here to escape, to test himself, but now he was tangled in something deeper, her trust, her world. And the longer he stayed, the harder it became to reconcile the man he was pretending to be with the one he'd left behind. As he pedaled home under a sky streaked with stars, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Vanessa, board's calling an emergency meeting. You're out of time. Ethan's grip tightened on the handlebars. The facade was crumbling, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it together, or if he even wanted to. The coastal town woke to a gray dawn, the sky heavy with clouds that mirrored the storm brewing in Ethan Caldwell's chest. 3 weeks at the seaside co-op had transformed him, his hands rougher, his stride surer, his mind quieter than it had ever been atop his corporate throne. But the messages from Vanessa, his lifeline to Caldwell Innovations, had grown insistent, a drumbeat he couldn't ignore. As he pedaled through the misty streets toward the market, the salty air felt less like freedom and more like a reckoning. He'd built a fragile life here as Ethan Moore, but the billionaire he'd buried was clawing his way back. The market was subdued that morning, the usual clamor dulled by the threat of rain. Mara was already at work, her sleeves rolled up as she sorted a delivery of clams, her braid damp from the mist. She glanced up as Ethan parked his bike, her expression shifting from focus to something softer, almost welcoming. You're early for once, she said, a teasing edge to her voice. Miracles do happen. Had to beat the storm, Ethan replied, forcing a smile as he grabbed a crate to help. They worked side by side, the rhythm of their movements syncing like a dance they'd perfected over weeks. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying Vanessa's last message, board's voting tomorrow. If you're not here, they'll replace you. The deadline loomed, a guillotine over his double life. As they finished unloading, Mara leaned against a stall post, wiping her hands on her apron. You're quiet today, she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Something eating you? Ethan hesitated, the lie he'd lived itching at his throat. Just tired, he said, avoiding her gaze. Long week. She didn't buy it, he could tell from the way her lips pressed into a thin line, but she let it drop. Well, perk up. There's a cleanup at the beach tonight. Volunteers needed. You in? Wouldn't miss it, he said, the words automatic. He'd grown addicted to these moments with her, to the way she pulled him into her world without asking permission. But every step closer to her widened the chasm between Ethan Moore and Ethan Caldwell, and he wasn't sure how to bridge it. The day dragged on, each delivery a test of his resolve. By evening, the clouds had parted, leaving a crisp, clear night perfect for the beach cleanup. Ethan arrived at the shore, his boots sinking into the sand as he spotted Mara near a bonfire, directing a group of volunteers with her usual command. She waved him over, handing him a trash bag and a pair of gloves. Stick with me, she said. We're tackling the north end, worst of the driftwood and junk. They worked together under the stars, picking through seaweed and plastic bottles, the fire's glow painting their shadows long and lean. The other volunteers chatted and laughed, but Ethan and Mara fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the crash of waves. Then, as they hauled a tangled fishing net from the sand, she spoke. You ever feel like you're running from something, Moore? Her question caught him off guard, his hands stilling on the net. What makes you say that? You've got that look, she said, her voice low, almost lost in the wind. Like you're here, but part of you's somewhere else. I've seen it before, people drifting through, carrying ghosts. Ethan's chest tightened. She saw too much, always had. Maybe I am, he admitted, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. But I'm trying to figure out what I'm running toward. Mara studied him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Hope you find it, she said simply, then turned back to the net. But her words lingered, a challenge he couldn't shake. As the cleanup wound down, the volunteers gathered around the bonfire, sharing stories and passing around mugs of hot cider. Ethan sat beside Mara, the heat of the flames warming his face as she talked about the beach, how it had been her refuge growing up, a place to escape her mother's illness and the co-op's demands. Still is, sometimes, she added, her voice softening. You've got a place like that? He thought of his penthouse, cold and pristine, then of this beach, alive with her presence. Starting to, he said, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the world narrowed to just them, the fire, the waves, the unspoken pull drawing them closer. Then a volunteer called her over, and the moment broke. Later, as they walked back toward town, the sand crunching under their boots, Mara slowed her pace. Thanks for tonight, she said, her breath visible in the chilly air. You're good company, more. So are you, he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. She smiled, a rare, unguarded smile that made his heart lurch, and for a second, he thought she might say more. But she just nodded and kept walking, leaving him to wrestle with the truth he couldn't yet voice. Back at his apartment, Ethan's phone buzzed again. Vanessa's voice crackled through when he answered, sharp and urgent. Ethan, this isn't a game anymore. The board's meeting at 8 a.m. tomorrow. If you're not on that jet tonight, you're done. I can't stall them again. He paced the tiny room, the walls closing in. I need a few more days, he said, desperation creeping into his tone. I'm not ready to leave. Leave what? Vanessa snapped. Your little vacation. You're Ethan Caldwell, not some nobody playing errand boy. What's going on? He sank onto the bed, running a hand through his hair. It's not a vacation. It's real. She's real. Silence stretched on the line, then Vanessa sighed. You're in over your head. Jet's waiting at the airstrip. Be on it, or don't bother coming back at all. The call ended, leaving him staring at the peeling wallpaper. He didn't sleep that night, torn between two worlds. By dawn, he'd made his choice. He pedaled to the market, his heart pounding as he found Mara at her stall. I've got to go, he said, the words tasting like ash. Something came up. Her face hardened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of hurt. Knew you were a drifter, she said, turning back to her work. Safe travels, more. Mara, he started, but she waved him off, her walls slamming back into place. He left the market, the weight of her dismissal heavier than any boardroom loss. Hours later, he sat on the private jet, staring out at the receding coastline. He'd saved his company, barely, but as the town faded from view, he knew he'd lost something more. Mara's face haunted him, her trust a casualty of his silence. And as the jet climbed higher, Ethan realized he wasn't just leaving her behind, he was leaving the man he'd become. The hum of the jet engines faded as Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the tarmac, the sleek skyline of the city he'd once ruled glinting in the late afternoon sun. His tailored suit felt like armor, stiff and foreign after weeks in thrift store denim, but it was the weight of his decision that pressed hardest against him. He'd flown back to save Caldwell Innovations, facing down a furious board with the charisma and steel that had built his empire. The vote had been close, but he'd won, retaining his title, his power, his legacy. Yet as he climbed into the waiting Bentley, the victory tasted hollow. The coastal town, Mara, and the man he'd been as Ethan Moore lingered in his mind like a song he couldn't unhear. Back in his penthouse, the silence was deafening. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of the city's pulsing lights, but the space felt sterile: marble floors, modern art, furniture that cost more than most people's homes. He poured a glass of whiskey, the burn doing little to quiet the restlessness clawing at him. For days, he threw himself into work, meetings, mergers, late nights poring over projections, but the rhythm that had once defined him felt off. Vanessa noticed, her sharp eyes catching the cracks in his usual focus. "You're here, but you're not," she said one evening, leaning against his office door. "What happened out there?" Ethan didn't answer, just stared at the skyline beyond his desk. He couldn't explain it, not fully. The town had stripped him bare, shown him a life unburdened by wealth or expectation, and Mara had been the heart of it. Her strength, her honesty, the way she'd seen him without knowing who he was, it had changed him. And leaving her, letting her believe he was just another drifter, gnawed at him like a wound that wouldn't heal. A week after his return, he made a decision. He called Vanessa into his office, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm going back," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "You're taking over as interim CEO. I've drafted the transition plan, 6 months, minimum. I trust you to run this place." Her jaw dropped, a rare break in her composure. "Ethan, you just fought to keep this seat. Now you're walking away." "Not walking away," he corrected, standing to face the window. "Stepping back. I need to fix someone I left behind." Vanessa studied him, then nodded slowly. "This about her?" He didn't deny it. "It's about me, too." 2 days later, Ethan landed back at the coastal airstrip, the salty breeze a jolt to his senses. He'd traded the suit for jeans and a jacket, not the thrift store one, but close enough, and carried a duffel bag instead of a briefcase. The town felt different yet achingly familiar as he pedaled a rented bike toward the market, his heart hammering with every turn of the wheel. He wasn't sure what he'd say, or if Mara would even listen, but he had to try. The seaside co-op was quieter than he remembered, the season shifting toward fall, the crowds thinning. Mara stood at her stall, haggling with a fisherman over a crate of mackerel, her braid glinting in the muted sunlight. She didn't see him at first, and he took a moment to watch her, the way her hands moved with purpose, the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. Then she looked up, and their gazes locked. Her expression hardened instantly, her arms crossing over her chest. "What are you doing here, Moore?" Her voice was cold, but the edge of hurt beneath it cut deeper than any anger. "I owe you the truth," Ethan said, stepping closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Can we talk? Somewhere private?" Mara hesitated, her jaw tight, then jerked her chin toward the back of the stall. 5 minutes. That's all you get." They moved to a small storage shed, the air thick with the scent of salt and wood. Ethan set his bag down, meeting her steely gaze. "My name's not Ethan Moore," he began, the words tumbling out. "It's Ethan Caldwell. I ran, a company, a big one. I came here to get away from it, to see if I could be someone else. I didn't expect you, Mara. I didn't expect any of this." Her eyes widened, then narrowed, processing his confession. "So you're some rich guy playing poor? And what, I was part of your little experiment?" Her voice trembled with fury, but her hands clenched at her sides, betraying the depth of her betrayal. "No," he said quickly, stepping closer. "You were never an experiment. You were real, the most real thing I've ever known. I lied about who I was, but not about how I felt. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done." Mara turned away, her breath uneven. "You think that fixes it? You waltz back here with your fancy name and expect me to, what? Forgive you because you're sorry?" "I don't expect anything," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "I came back because I couldn't stay away. Because you showed me what matters, work that means something, people who depend on you, not just numbers on a screen. I'm stepping away from the company, Mara. For good, if that's what it takes to prove I'm not running anymore. She faced him then, her eyes searching his, raw and unguarded. Why should I believe you? Because I'm here, he said simply. And I'll stay as long as you'll let me, however you'll have me. No lies this time. For a long moment, she said nothing, the silence stretching between them like a tightrope. Then she exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. You're an idiot, she muttered, but the venom was gone, replaced by something tentative, almost hopeful. And I'm not saying I trust you, not yet. But, you can start by unloading that fish out there. We'll see if you're worth keeping around. Ethan's lips twitched into a grin, relief flooding him. Fair enough. Over the next weeks, he worked harder than he ever had, hauling crates, fixing bikes, even helping Mara repair a storm-damaged stall. The town watched with curiosity, whispers of his true identity spreading, but he didn't care. He was Ethan Caldwell, yes, but he was also Ethan Moore, the man who'd found his heart on this rugged coast. One evening, as they sat on the beach after a long day, Mara handed him a mug of tea, her fingers brushing his. You're still here, she said, her voice soft, a question beneath the statement. Always will be, he replied, meeting her gaze. She didn't pull away this time, and when she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, he knew he'd found home, not in the town, but in her. The ocean stretched before them, endless and wild, and for the first time, Ethan felt whole, not a billionaire, not a drifter, but a man who dared to chase what mattered most.